you've already started to talk about my next question, but maybe you have any specific thoughts maybe you have some specific thoughts you might share, both about Indian and about Chinese business leadership as a general phenomenon. I know this is painting with a broad brush. What do you see as some of the strengths or some of the weaknesses, both on the Indian side and on the Chinese side, of business leadership? There are some similarities, as you said. There are also differences. Could you evaluate them more?
I mean, if you're looking at the weakness of both the Indian and Chinese system, clearly they are trying to address this issue of growth, fast growth, rapid growth. And they just don't have, some of them don't have the experience or the wherewithal in terms of resources to manage it. And they don't have sometimes the systems to manage it. They're evolving. I think that's a weakness. They leave a lot on the table. Sometimes there are holes in what they do. Sometimes there are losses, especially in China, their growth, because many of their companies are not driven by the stock market. So large investments are made which are sometimes wasteful. So I think they're struggling with that. Same thing happens ditto in India, where the Indian government entities do the same thing.
Right.
But at least in the private sector,
not so in the private sector,
where we
sure.
have tyranny of the market driving our so I think that's where the difference is. China is so largely government dominated in terms of their growth, and so they tend to do it. Their view is that you should take a longer term horizon. If you're building a road or a big plant, they'll add capacity 6 times. In India, we would do it incrementally. Right. Now their view is that why are you seeing it 5 years? Why don't you see it 10 years? This is infrastructure. And therefore they have a huge infrastructure. Whereas we are now struggling to build infrastructure. So, in India. Right. So this is where I think the difference in the way they look at it. So they tend to take a much longer view. They have a scale in mind which is much larger than the way India thinks of scale.
Still staying with leadership patterns in China and India, it seems to me one of the themes you have talked about is how, just as your leadership pattern changed over time depending on the context you were in, do you believe the leadership pattern of Indian business or Chinese business has changed? For instance, has there been the emergence of a different kind of leadership pattern in Indian business after the reforms of 1991? Any thoughts you'd care to share in that domain?
Well, I mean, I used to work in India before the reform and post-reform. So there's a clear watershed. There's no debate in anyone's mind in India that the private sector of Indian business was shaken substantially. In our own Tata Group, we had big changes. So that was a watershed. And the mindset opened up to growth, competition, globalization, all those nice things that we now talk about happened with that. So that was the change in leadership. China had it earlier, but they also went through phases. You had the Deng reform, then you had Zhu Rongji as a prime minister and WTO opening for China in the 90s. So there were a lot of that. China in 90s, post-WTO was a very different China from the Deng's China.
Indeed.
And subsequently, with China having the last 5 years clearly demonstrating superior growth globally by a long shot, is another different China. So there are 3 phases that I see of China. I've seen it in the Deng leadership time. I've seen it post-WTO when in 1998, I think the Zhu Rongji was the prime minister. And he opened up China to the world in a much bigger way. And then in the last 3 or 4 years, where China has grown so substantially in every aspect, the 8.5%, 9.5% growth rates are astronomical for a country of that scale and size. And so what are the challenges at that rate?
Right.
Are totally different.
So let me invite you to just extend that logic and think about the future. Both India and China are currently on very impressive growth trajectories. There are also, of course, some potential constraints to this impressive growth continuing indefinitely at this rate. Is the availability of skilled leaders going to become one of the important gating factors in either India or China or both?
I think that's an issue which worries us every day. Where are we going to find people? And more importantly, good leaders who are going to handle this growth, because we see this growth continuing for some time in both countries. It's not going to taper off in a hurry unless... availability of leadership which is global in nature now, because now we are globalizing, both of us. And China, I think, has a bigger challenge in finding global leaders than India to some extent, because they started a little late. And their global companies are mostly the public sectors which are in resources.
The state-owned enterprises.
State-owned enterprises. But I think what both of us will do, will use, we will develop leadership through accelerated systems. I think China is using it better than India. I think they tend to use their non-residents who are coming back to Chinese, many of them were in this country, to use them and get them back into. And I have seen some very good talent which is coming back into China. So they have a pool of talent which is outside, which they are drawing on. Then they have a pool of talent around Hong Kong and on Taiwan and some of the Southeast Asian countries which have the Chinese, ethnic Chinese. Who are there. So they have that big pool to draw from. That's about 50 million, as they say.
Right.
India has this 20 million pool outside India. Many of them in this country doing well. So I think we have to start using that pool better, especially in global affairs. They have started a little faster because they are running short of good talent. But both of us will have this issue of how do we going to get leadership.
Isn't it starting to happen in India as well?
It is. Indian government has made efforts and individual companies have started doing that. But it's not in the same scale as China has done. It's not.
So if you actually think of 2 or 3 action steps that either business might take or government might take or both might cooperate in increasing this availability of skilled business leaders, what would it be for China and for India?
To build these.
What steps might business or government take to increase the supply of skilled leaders of the kind that you believe are really needed?
I think what will happen is, what will need to be done in both countries is one will be in-company development, where companies will have to develop themselves through mentoring, through training, leadership training. And most Indian companies, the big good ones, have started leadership training in a big way. There's no debate. A lot of budgets are going into that. And that is a reflection of the shortage that we foresee. The high attrition rates, etc., that are going on. So that the companies have to do, but they can't do all of it together. The governments have to build this infrastructure of basic education and then thereafter management education, technical education, certification processes, which has to be done in leadership at all levels. So there's a part of government which I think both are realizing the government has a big role in this. It can't just abdicate this to the private sector.
Indeed.
And finally, I think there'll be select global hires, whether they are Indians or non-resident Indians or non-resident Chinese or global people. I mean, in Tata Group, we have just hired ex-General Motors person to run Tata Motors.
I did see that,
so,
yes.
And the same thing in Tata Hotels. They're run by a Chinese American. So select global hires. A lot of Indian companies are going to do that. Same thing with ditto with China. As you know, Lenovo used to be run by the Extel person. So they are, both countries will do select global hires. But those can't be large numbers. They will be at leadership levels who can bring a level of globalization into the organization.
So you mentioned education, and it occurs to me that recently I have read in the news that the current Human Resource Development Minister in India, Mr. Kapil Sibal, is leading some interesting initiatives in trying to bring foreign universities into India. This bill has been passed by the cabinet and will be tabled before Parliament. What do you see as the role of foreign universities going forward in a country like India? How might they contribute to this need for skilled business leaders? Of course, this will take time. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is what is driving this. The two things that are driving it, from economics point of view. good economics, that 80, 90,000 people come here to this country to study in
To the
top
US.
universities in
Yeah.
the US.
Yeah.
Surely we can have the US universities coming to India and doing the same thing. So there is an economic logic for that. Second, of course, is to build the skill base. India does not have, other than a few IITs and IIMs, does not have good university structures. And I think if these can catalyze good university education, that could be a great story for India. I think it's necessary, it's needed. We have taken too long debating on this very narrow, parochial, nationalistic view,
Right.
which I think an open society in India has gone through the debate. I think the debate is over. Clearly, a lot more people want it to happen. There will be always naysayers who would not want to see that happen. But I think this is a great idea.
And you're optimistic that it will
I
happen?
think it will go through.
Yeah,
There is no debate on that. There is a consensus behind it.
indeed. Any comparable comments about China?
China has also done it. Some of the universities have already tied up with a lot of US universities, European universities. So they understand the value these universities bring. They haven't yet fully opened it up to have a complete university. I think some of their pedagogy is kind of controlled.
Right.
So, but they have some large arrangements with most of the large US universities. I see that all the time. So they have done the same thing.
Let's return for a moment to the question of Chinese and Indian business leaders. I know we talked about the future and what the gating factors might be, but do you see the very nature of the requirements changing? I know you mentioned, for instance, growth has been a top priority in Asia, but either for China or for India, do you see any different kinds of leadership challenges coming up in the next few years, let's say the next 10 years or so? Or will it be more of the same?
No, I think what we find is that every 5 years, the markets change substantially. And either it is technical innovation or societal reorganization, which throws up challenges for organizations. Sometimes the change is 5 years, sometimes 10 years, 7 years. But we saw the internet boom, we saw before that. So we are expecting something else will happen as well. So we are going to see those changes coming.
Even though it's difficult to predict.
It may not be in the horizon, but
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be a very big optimist to think that life will remain as it is. I mean, the only change is the only constant, as we say, right? Especially in our business with technology, you can't even think of not having change. So I think we are all anticipating change. How ready we are going to be, all of us, is going to be different. That will determine the winners and losers, really, in those organizations. Because there are going to be game changers. There are going to be people who are going to come and kill your business. We are paranoid. I mean, as Andy Grove said, you've got to be paranoid to survive.
Indeed. Returning to you again, yourself, as we come toward the end of our very enjoyable interview, is there anything that you can identify in your own leadership style that is particularly Indian? Or for that matter, were you influenced by being in China in a certain way?
Well, certainly my growing up years were in India. It was kind of steeped in Indian tradition and our mythology. I think it allows me to really revel in the world of uncertainty much better.
The world of uncertainty.
Making order out of what is commonly seen by many as chaos. I think our mythology and part of our religious ethos is around that. It is, from the sublime to the ridiculous. And if you can handle these two ends of an issue, you have this ability to move without getting confused. I think India has taught me that in the leadership style. In China, I have always appreciated the level of orderliness and the Confucian view which goes around family, respect for elders, order, faith from China. Can we bring the two together to get the best out of these two is really the challenge of companies which are managing both countries.
Do you see that as desirable, trying to sort of take the best of both and try to
They are
create
two
something
quite
new.
polar opposites, as you
They
must
are
have
quite
seen.
different, yeah.
One creates innovation and ideas, and the other creates a huge, powerful execution machine. I remember when the Chinese Prime Minister visited TCS in Bangalore, and he said, "You are good in software and we are good in hardware, and together two of us can be leaders." I remember he made that statement in our center in China, in Bangalore. And I think that's what it is. The software side of thinking clearly is an Indian strength. And it comes out of this ethos of our backgrounds. And the execution capability of China is, and their ability to think scale and big is an advantage. If we can combine the two, I think can we combine the two is the question I very often think about.
Very interesting. Of course, not only do corporations need both, I think each country needs both. So there is much to learn in India from China and vice versa.
Oh yes. Both of them ask and learn from each other. As I always say, we have been neighbors for 5,000 years. We have given them some of their spiritual background to Buddhism. We have taken from them a lot of things about innovation that they had in the early parts of the history.
Just before we end, I would tell you that in my travels in China, there was one incident that really stood out, at which I was talking with the dean of a prominent business school in Shanghai. And we were talking about the possibility. I introduced the possibility of doing a three-way collaboration between Singapore and China and India. And after a pause, my Chinese host returned to it and said something which I found pretty astonishing. And the statement was, "Professor Singh, we in China are deeply aware of the civilizational contributions that India has made to Chinese culture and society." And the point was, he says, "we would be very happy to cooperate." In your travels through China, is this something that you have noticed, that at a rather deep level, there is a recognition of India's contributions to China in the past? There is also a recognition that in the contemporary present, China is in many fields ahead of India, although in some fields India does have the edge.
In my travels, I have traveled the length and breadth of China. I've met a lot of people, government, individuals, students, employees. One thing is very clear. Nearly 99% of them would have a huge respect for what they call Indian wisdom. This has been the southern neighbor, and they have respected. Over 5,000 years. There is no debate on this issue, and as I said, there's a unanimity on this issue.
Indeed.
Now, that's as far as the historic issues come up. What I think that has to be translated into
The present.
Now,
Yes.
I think Indians are, on the other hand, are a little wary of the growth of China in terms of the scale and size that they are. So when we look at, I've led business delegations to China to say, can we do something? Indian business is scared of being able to operate in China in the scale and the competitiveness of China. China is a very competitive industry, market, extremely competitive markets, very entrepreneurial people. So the Indian businesses are scared of putting their foot in there. And I keep telling them, you got to do it the way we did it, which is build brick by brick. There is no shortcut.
Indeed.
Because this is going to be a huge market in the future. So they are scared of the scale and size that China builds. And I give this example to everyone. I went on the Ningbo Bridge, which is for the Shanghai Expo they have built. 28 kilometers over the sea, over the Ningbo Bay. In 3 years flat, 6-lane highway. It has taken us 15 years in Bombay to build a sea link of 2.5 kilometers.
Indeed. It's still not done.
Or still halfway. So,
very interesting. Is there anything else you would like to add? Just an open-ended invitation to say anything you want about the subject we have been talking about.
I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about leadership. We've talked about how leaderships are developed, the mentoring. We've talked about, of course, India and China, where we see the co-opetition, cooperating and competing. Yes. Yeah, we talked about management style. I think we live in very exciting times. Sometimes when you are sitting in the West, it looks a little more slower than we see it in our part of the world. So we live in exciting times. We are the lucky continent, as I say to our people, where growth is at least underwritten now for the next few years by the growth of these two giants. There is a very interesting picture which defines the growth of Asia in the Copenhagen summit, where you had the US president dealing with the Indian prime minister and the Chinese prime minister. There was one photo with the Brazilian president. There were just 4 of them doing the Copenhagen deal.
Very interesting.
That was a world challenge. That is how it was done. It may not be, everyone's not happy with it, but I'm just saying to you that I think the role of Asia is going to be critical. Asia is a more mature economy in terms of maturity of thought and leadership. We are learning a lot in technology and management styles from here. A lot of our people are trained here, and that's a great story. So it's an exciting time for our younger people in both countries because they're going to see growth. They haven't seen too much of a recession as yet. But one day you will have cycles. There are business cycles.
Which will be the next challenge we can talk about. Girija Pande, thank you very much. This has been very enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Jitendra. Thank you for having me here.